Episode 1. The Invitation I. The letter. It started with a letter. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, staring at the old envelope. It was cream-colored, the edges frayed, and the handwriting was unlike anything she had seen before. Elegant, with looping letters that looked almost too precise, too deliberate. The address was written in golden ink, faint and reflective, as if it had been embossed by hand. She could feel her heart skip a beat, an unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. The return address was unfamiliar. There was no name, no indication of where it had come from. The only words were, "For your eyes only, come, and the truth will be revealed." Her pulse quickened as she traced her finger over the words. She had never been one for superstitions, but there was something about this letter, something that didn't sit right. She had been living in the sleepy town of Ravenscroft for over 5 years, and nothing ever happened here. The people were quiet, the streets empty by night, and the town itself felt like a place lost in time, too far removed from the world. But this letter felt like a call she couldn't ignore. The second, the mystery of Ravenscroft, the town of Ravenscroft, wasn't anything special. It had its local diner, its quaint little bookstore, and a single streetlight that flickered every night at precisely midnight. The pavement was cracked, the houses lined with overgrown hedges, and the atmosphere was always shrouded in an eerie silence, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Yet there was one thing that had always unsettled Evelyn about Ravenscroft, the old mansion perched on the hill at the far end of town. Black Hollow Manor, as it was called, was the oldest building in the area. No one lived there. No one ever had. The windows were covered in layers of dust, the iron gates rusted and barely hanging on their hinges. The house seemed to loom over the town, casting a shadow that never left, like a silent witness to the passage of time. As a child, Evelyn had heard the stories. The stories about the lost family, the whispers in the night, and the mysterious disappearances that had occurred in Ravenscroft decades ago. People said the manor was haunted, that something dark lived within its walls. But now, after all these years, the memories of those tales had faded. Ravenscroft had become just another place, a home for those who sought peace, away from the chaos of the world. Or so it seemed. And yet, as Evelyn stared at the letter in her hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling her. The mention of truth stirred something deep inside her, an unanswered question she had never fully explored. It was time to face it, time to find out what lay beyond the veil of Ravenscroft's past. With one last glance at the envelope, Evelyn stood up, her fingers trembling slightly. She had to go to the manor. No matter how strange it seemed, something deep down told her this was a path she had to follow. The third, the road to Black Hollow Manor. The drive up to Black Hollow Manor was long, winding, and filled with an unsettling silence. The narrow, gravel road twisted through the thick woods, the trees standing like silent sentinels on either side. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching her, their gnarled branches reaching out as though to touch her. Her headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to settle on the road. The atmosphere was oppressive, suffocating even, as if the very air was thick with a sense of dread. As she neared the entrance to the manor, her pulse quickened. The iron gates that led to the manor's grounds were open, as if inviting her in. The path ahead was dark, shrouded in mist, and the manor loomed in the distance like a haunted castle from a forgotten fairy tale. Evelyn parked her car in front of the gates, stepping out onto the damp earth. Her feet crunched on the gravel as she walked toward the massive stone steps leading up to the manor. The house was even more imposing up close, its windows dark, the once grand structure now decaying under the weight of age. Ivy crawled up its sides, entwining itself in the stonework like a veil of shadows, covering the secrets within. Her breath was visible in the cold air, and as she reached for the doorbell, she hesitated. The silence around her was almost deafening. No birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, only an eerie stillness. The door, much to her surprise, opened with a soft creak before she could even ring the bell. Inside, the house was just as eerie as the exterior. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper, the scent of mildew hanging in the air. The furniture was old and worn, draped in dusty sheets that made the place feel as if it hadn't been lived in for years. The only source of light came from the flickering flames of an old fireplace, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. "Welcome," came a voice from the shadows. Evelyn spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. Standing in the doorway of the grand hallway was an older man, his face gaunt and his clothes old-fashioned, almost as if he had stepped out of a different time altogether. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity, and he held out his hand. "I knew you would come," he said, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "The invitation was not just for you, but for the others. You are not alone, Evelyn. This place, this house, has been waiting for you." The secrets of the house. The man led Evelyn through the mansion's dark hallways, each room they passed filled with old portraits and relics from a time long gone. The deeper they ventured into the house, the more oppressive the air became, as though the very walls were alive, breathing with the weight of history. Finally, they reached a large room at the back of the manor, a library, with towering shelves filled with ancient books and dusty tomes. In the center of the room was a large table, upon which lay a collection of old photographs, letters, and a strange black box. The man gestured for Evelyn to sit. "This," he said, "is where it all begins." He explained that the manor had once been home to a secret society, a cult of sorts, dedicated to uncovering the hidden knowledge of the universe. They had sought to communicate with the dead, to uncover the secrets of life after death. But something had gone terribly wrong. The cult had disappeared without a trace, and the house had been abandoned. But the truth was far darker than Evelyn could have ever imagined. As the man spoke, Evelyn felt the walls of the house closing in around her. The air was thick, heavy with secrets, and she could hear the whispers again, growing louder. The house wasn't just a witness to the past, it was alive, and it was calling out to her. Episode 2, Echoes of the Past I. The invitation continues. Evelyn sat in the library, her fingers trembling as she reached for the ancient letters scattered across the table. The dim light from the fireplace flickered in the background, casting shadows across the room, and the distant whispers continued to swirl in the air around her, growing louder with each passing second. The man who had greeted her earlier, Mr. Blackwood, was standing near the far corner of the room, his piercing eyes fixed on her. He had said little after his initial introduction, his silent presence somehow making the air feel even heavier. His face was unreadable, his expression locked in a quiet, almost calm demeanor, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her closely. The letter she had received, the one that led her here, had been mysterious in its own right, but this was different. There was a tangible energy in the air now, something almost palpable, as if the house itself was watching her, urging her to uncover what it held. Her eyes fell on the photographs on the table. Some were so old that the faces in the images had blurred, their features hard to distinguish, while others were still clear enough to see. There was one photograph that caught her attention, a black and white image of a group of people standing in front of the manor, all of them with stern faces and cloaked in shadows. In the center stood a tall figure, a woman, her eyes gleaming with something otherworldly, her hands raised in a position that could have been a ritualistic gesture. Who were they? Evelyn asked, her voice breaking the silence. She couldn't help herself. She needed to know. There was an undeniable pull, a magnetic force drawing her into this mystery. Mr. Blackwood slowly turned to face her, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. They were the first. His voice was low, almost reverent, the first to enter the manor, to awaken its power. They made a choice that tied their souls to this house forever. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He paused before answering, as if carefully choosing his words. "They made a pact with forces beyond our understanding. They sought immortality, knowledge beyond the grave, but at a cost." Evelyn glanced at the picture again, studying the faces in the photo. The woman in the center stood out. There was something about her, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. Did they succeed? A dark, almost sad smile flickered across Mr. Blackwood's lips. In a way, yes, but they didn't get what they expected. The second, the cult's legacy. The more Evelyn learned about the cult that once inhabited Black Hollow Manor, the more she felt like she was stepping into a world she couldn't possibly understand. Each layer of the story seemed to reveal more darkness, more dangerous secrets. The group had once been well respected in the town, mystics, seers, people who claimed to communicate with the dead. But somewhere along the line, their hunger for knowledge had turned to something far darker. They had begun performing rituals to communicate with beings from the other side, beings that existed in realms far beyond the mortal coil. Mr. Blackwood had shared the details in a matter-of-fact tone, as if the horrors he spoke of were nothing new, nothing that had shaken him anymore. But Evelyn could feel the weight of their consequences. It turned out the cult's leader, Isabel Carver, had been the woman in the photograph, the one with the piercing eyes. She had been the one to perform the final ritual, the one to attempt to open the veil between the living and the dead. But instead of gaining the knowledge they had sought, the cult had unwittingly unleashed something far worse, an ancient entity, something that had been bound to the manor for centuries, something that had awoken and was now seeking to reclaim its place in the living world. Evelyn shivered, the image of Isabel's cold, unyielding gaze still fresh in her mind. What had she unleashed? And what had she sacrificed in return for whatever dark knowledge she had obtained? The third, the secrets beneath the floorboards. The night stretched on, and as the clock struck midnight, Evelyn found herself once again walking through the shadowed halls of Black Hollow Manor. The house had a strange way of seeming to shift as she moved through it, like the walls were constantly rearranging themselves. Every time she turned a corner, a new room seemed to appear, or an old room would be filled with a strange, cold air that made her skin crawl. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just behind her, watching her every move. The whispering voices were becoming louder again, so loud now that she could barely hear her own thoughts. It was as if the house itself was alive, its very bones creaking and groaning in protest to her presence. Or perhaps it was the spirits of those who had been trapped here, those who had tried and failed to control the forces they had awakened. Evelyn followed the whispers, unable to resist their pull. They led her to a narrow hallway at the back of the house, one she hadn't noticed before. At the end of the hall was a door, old and weathered, with carvings on the surface that seemed to change every time she looked at them. "What's in there?" Evelyn whispered, though she didn't need to ask. She already knew. The fourth, the house speaks. The door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for her. The room inside was dark, but she could see faint traces of scratches on the floor, like something had been dragged across the wood over and over again. The smell was musty, like decay, but there was something else too, something far darker. A presence that filled the room and seemed to press in on her from all sides. There, in the center of the room, was an old chest, the wood weathered and cracked. The whispers had grown louder now, so loud that they were almost shouting, but Evelyn couldn't make out the words. The only thing she could focus on was the chest, the mysterious object that had been hidden away all these years. Open it. The voice wasn't from the whispers. It was a voice, a real voice, one that seemed to come from within the chest itself. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a longing that Evelyn couldn't comprehend. Episode 3. The ritual begins. Uncovering the secrets. The cold night air hung heavy as Evelyn stood before the massive weathered chest in the forgotten room of Black Hollow Manor. Her breath, visible in the freezing air, seemed to shiver and waver, matching the tense energy in the room. She had found it, the source of all the whispers that had been drawing her deeper into the dark heart of this haunted place. The chest before her was ancient, its wood darkened with age, the corners chipped and cracked from years of neglect. The faint carvings on its surface seemed to writhe as she gazed at them, forming fleeting patterns that shifted whenever she blinked. Open it. The voice had come again, deeper and more insistent than before. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she reached for the chest. There was an undeniable pull within her, a magnetic force drawing her toward it. Every inch of her skin felt as if it were being watched, not just by the walls of the manor, but by something far older, far darker. She hesitated for just a moment before slowly lifting the heavy lid. As she did, a gust of cold air rushed out, and the room seemed to darken around her. The weight of time pressed down on her, and the darkness within the chest seemed to pull at her very soul. Inside the chest, she found ancient relics, a collection of dusty tomes, fragile papers, and strange symbols that looked like they had been drawn with blood. But what caught her attention the most was a single blackened stone, sitting in the center of the chest like a shard of the night itself. Its surface was smooth and gleaming, but the longer she stared at it, the more she felt as if it were alive, pulsing with an ancient energy. The moment her fingers brushed against the stone, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned as if they were shaking awake, and Evelyn's heart raced in her chest. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, and they were no longer faint, they were calling her name. The second, the ritual's origins, Evelyn slammed the lid shut, her heart hammering in her chest. The stone pulsed once more beneath her fingers, and the whispers quieted, leaving an unsettling silence behind. She knew she couldn't ignore this anymore. The truth was buried somewhere in the heart of Black Hollow Manor, and it had something to do with Isabel Carver and the rituals she had conducted. "I have to know what they were trying to do," Evelyn whispered to herself. She turned and walked back toward the main hall, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally as if trying to hold her in place. The air grew heavier, thick with something ancient that lingered in the corners of the house. The manor was no longer just a house. It had become something else, something alive, and it was feeding on her fear. Evelyn found herself back in the library, the ancient journal from before still lying on the table. The pages were filled with frantic writing, the ink bleeding in places as though the words had been written in a rush. In desperation, she began flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the cryptic symbols and the frantic scribbles that covered the parchment. Suddenly, her eyes landed on a familiar phrase, "the ritual of the veil." The words were written in the same looping handwriting as the letter she had received. To open the doorway, she read aloud, "To the other side, the veil must be torn." Her heart stopped. This was it, the ritual that had opened the doorway between the living and the dead. It was the cause of everything, the reason the spirits of the manor lingered, the reason the house itself felt so alive. The more Evelyn read, the more she realized the truth. Isabel Carver and her followers had tried to transcend death, to communicate with those on the other side. They had believed they could control the spirits, tap into their power, but in doing so, they had unleashed something far darker. The ritual had torn the veil, allowing not just the dead to come through, but something far more malevolent, something that would stop at nothing to claim the living as well. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she turned the page, her breath shallow. The last few lines were different. "The cost will be eternal. Only those marked by the stone may pass through." It was signed with the name Isabel Carver. The third, the presence in the walls. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, almost solidifying, moving closer as if the very walls themselves were closing in. Evelyn could feel a cold breath on the back of her neck, the whispers now turning into a single, unified voice. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice echoed through the room, deep and guttural, as though it was coming from the house itself. Evelyn turned, her heart racing, but there was no one there. The shadows flickered and writhed, as though they were alive, feeding off the fear in her chest. The air grew even heavier, and the temperature dropped, her breath now visible in the frigid space. "Leave. Now." Evelyn's legs shook as she stepped backward. The presence in the room was growing, becoming more powerful. It felt like the very foundation of the house was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. The whispers became louder, almost deafening now, pressing against her mind, pushing her toward the edge of sanity. With a final glance at the journal, Evelyn rushed to the door, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't stay here. Not now. Not when she knew the truth. Not when she had uncovered the horrifying past that had bound this place to the darkness. But as she reached for the door, she stopped. The stone, the one she had touched earlier, was in her pocket, its cold, pulsating energy still lingering in the fabric. Evelyn pulled it out and stared at it, the blackened surface gleaming ominously. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. For the unseen hand as Evelyn stood in the doorway, staring at the stone, the shadows in the room seemed to grow taller, stretching toward her. The air was filled with an oppressive energy, one that seemed to press down on her chest. The whispers were no longer distant. They were right behind her, in her ear, in her mind. She turned, but this time, it wasn't just the shadows that moved. A hand, cold as death, reached out from the darkness and grabbed her wrist. "You're too late," the voice said, its tone low and menacing, like the last breath of a dying man. Evelyn tried to scream, but no sound came. She struggled against the grip, but it was too strong, pulling her back toward the room. And then she saw it, Isabel Carver, the woman from the photograph, standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing with a malevolent fire. "You should have never come here," Isabel said, her voice a whisper of darkness. "Now, the veil will claim you as it claimed me." Episode 4. The Haunting Grows Why. The unseen hand, the air in Black Hollow Manor was suffocating. The mansion, once seemingly dormant, now pulsed with an almost tangible energy. The walls seemed to whisper. The shadows seemed to breathe. Evelyn could feel it. The house was alive, and it was pulling her deeper into its mysteries. The journal in her hand had told her enough. The cult had succeeded in breaking the veil between the living and the dead, but it had also unleashed something far darker. Something that now fed on fear, regret, and death itself. The encounter with Isabel Carver, the woman in the portrait, was still fresh in Evelyn's mind. Her ghostly presence lingered in the corners of her thoughts, a reminder that the manor was no place for the living. Yet, despite the growing fear in her chest, Evelyn couldn't turn away. The mysteries of the manor and the twisted legacy of the cult called to her. She needed to know more. The stone in her pocket, cold and unyielding, pulsed gently, as if alive, a constant reminder of the darkness she had unleashed. Evelyn walked through the narrow, dust-choked hallway, the boards creaking beneath her feet. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the soft whispers that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "What have I awakened?" she whispered to herself, but no one answered. Not out loud. Her footsteps slowed as she approached the grand staircase, where shadows danced in the dim light. Something felt off, wrong. The air seemed heavier, charged with a malevolent presence. She turned toward the old portraits lining the wall, their eyes following her every move. The faces of those who had lived here, or perhaps died here, stared at her with hollow, dead eyes. Suddenly, she heard a sound of soft scratching, like fingernails on wood. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling in the silence. The sound stopped. Silence. She moved toward the sound, her heart thudding in her chest. Every step seemed to be echoed back to her, as though the house was mirroring her every move. As she reached the far end of the hall, she saw it, the door half open, the hinges creaking as if beckoning her inside. It was a door she hadn't noticed before, a door that had been hidden in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the very walls were calling her name. "Don't open it." The voice came from behind her, so sudden that she spun around, heart racing. But there was nothing, just the darkness and silence of the manor. She was alone. Or was she? The whispers came again, this time louder, almost demanding her attention. "It's time." With a deep breath, Evelyn reached for the door. The moment her fingers brushed against the handle, the house seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, her breath coming out in clouds. The stone in her pocket pulsed again, its coldness growing, filling her with an undeniable fear. She opened the door. The second, the forgotten room. The room inside was unlike any she had seen before. It was larger, the walls lined with old shelves, and a massive mirror hung on one wall. The mirror was antique, the glass cracked in places, as if it had been shattered and hastily repaired. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the dust in the room seemed to settle in thick layers, untouched for years. In the center of the room was an altar, its surface covered in strange symbols and faded candles. The shadows around it seemed to move, swirling like dark smoke, and Evelyn felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening as she took in the symbols on the altar. It was a ritual circle, the kind used in dark magic, designed to open doors to other worlds. Her heart raced as she realized the significance of what she was seeing. This was where they had performed their rituals, the cult of Isabel Carver. This was the place where they had broken the veil. But why had the circle remained untouched all these years? Was it waiting for someone to complete it? She stepped closer to the altar, her breath shallow. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, swirling in her mind. The mirror on the wall caught her attention again. It was strange, the way it reflected the room, but not her. She took a step closer. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she stared, the figure in the reflection grew clearer. It was a shadowed figure, its features blurred, its form barely human. Evelyn took a step back, but the figure in the mirror did not move. "Leave now," the figure whispered. Evelyn froze. The voice, it was the same one she had heard earlier, the voice that had warned her. The shadow moved in the reflection, as if it was alive, aware of her presence. She tried to turn away, but her body refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, urging her forward, toward the altar. It was as if the house itself had taken hold of her, dragging her toward the center of the ritual circle. "You must finish what was started." Evelyn reached for the altar, her hands trembling. The stone in her pocket pulsed again, its cold energy surging through her body. As her fingers brushed the edge of the altar, the ground beneath her feet shook. The house seemed to groan, its walls trembling with an unholy power. The shadow in the mirror moved closer. It was no longer blurred, its features were now visible, malevolent and twisted, a face she did not recognize. It was smiling, but not with kindness. The third, the unraveling. Suddenly, the room went dark. The light from the candles flickered, casting shadows that twisted and turned like living things. The whispers grew into a cacophony, each voice blending into the next, each word demanding something from her. Evelyn tried to move, but it was as if the house was holding her in place. The air grew thicker, colder, and the ground beneath her seemed to pulse, like a living thing. The reflection in the mirror stared at her, its smile growing wider, its eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. "You are the one who will set us free." The voice was louder now, almost booming, reverberating in the walls of the manor. Evelyn felt as if she were being pulled into the mirror, as if it were swallowing her whole. The stone in her pocket burned against her skin, its power seeping into her soul. The house was alive, and it wanted something from her. Episode 5. The Awakening 1. The whispering, dark Evelyn's breath quickened as she stood before the altar. The room had gone cold. The shadows, once playful and harmless, now twisted and grew longer, as if they were closing in around her. The whispers, those faint, maddening whispers, had turned into something far darker. The voices were angry, filled with a hunger she could almost feel. The air smelled of something ancient and decayed, the scent of rotting leaves and forgotten time. The weight of the house pressed down on her, its foundations shaking with an energy she could no longer ignore. Black Hollow Manor had awoken, and it was hungry. Hungry for answers, hungry for power, hungry for her. Evelyn stumbled backward from the altar, her eyes darting toward the mirror that had started it all. The figure in the reflection was no longer blurred, it was clear. The same face she had seen before, but now it was smiling, a grotesque smile that spread across the figure's face. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, flickering like the flames of the dying candles. "It's too late." The voice was no longer distant. It was inside her mind, curling around her thoughts like a serpent. "You've awakened us. There's no turning back now." Evelyn's heart raced as the shadow in the mirror grew larger, its form stretching toward her as if it was reaching through the glass, trying to pull her in. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls narrowing, the darkness growing. "Leave, leave, leave now." A voice in the back of her mind begged, but Evelyn couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her limbs heavy as if they were made of stone. Her vision blurred as the house began to pulse, its rhythm matching the beat of her heart. "We are free," the shadow said, its voice a low growl, barely human. "And you will be the one to carry our legacy." Evelyn tried to speak, but no words came. She felt a cold pressure against her chest, as though something was pushing against her very soul. The house had not just awoken, it had opened a door, and whatever lay beyond it was now reaching through. The second, a world beyond the veil. The ground beneath Evelyn's feet trembled. The walls of the manor seemed to stretch and shift, as though the house itself was alive, feeding off her fear. The whispering voices rose in a chaotic crescendo, their words now indistinguishable, blending together in a mad cacophony. Suddenly, the mirror shattered. The glass exploded outward, shards flying through the room like razor-sharp projectiles. Evelyn screamed as she shielded her face, but the pieces of glass passed right through her, as if she were no longer fully human. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadow in the mirror dissolved, leaving behind only a black void. From that void emerged a presence, a force so ancient, so powerful, that the very air seemed to suffocate in its wake. Evelyn felt the ground fall away beneath her feet. She was falling into an abyss of pure darkness. But then the darkness shifted. Shapes began to form. Figures, faces, distorted and twisted, appeared in the space around her. Their eyes glowed like burning embers, their forms flickering in and out of existence. They were the lost souls, the ones trapped between the living and the dead, unable to escape the curse of Black Hollow Manor. "Welcome to the other side," a voice boomed in her mind, deep and resonant. "You have opened the door. Now you will join us." Evelyn gasped as she felt the cold fingers of the spirits wrap around her, pulling her toward them. She tried to fight, to scream, but her voice was lost in the overwhelming darkness. The whispers from the walls, from the air, filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. They were calling her name, dragging her down into the very heart of the void. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the darkness released her. Evelyn gasped, stumbling back as she was suddenly thrown back into the library. The room around her seemed normal again, too normal, too quiet. The echoes of the spirits, the pulse of the house, were gone. But Evelyn knew it hadn't ended. She had seen it. She had felt it. The other side wasn't just a realm of the dead, it was a place of power, a place where something ancient lay waiting. The third, the book of binding shaking. Evelyn stood up. The stones of the manor's walls felt warm against her skin, and for a moment, the house seemed almost familiar. She wasn't sure if the visions she'd seen were real or just hallucinations, but the feeling was undeniable. Something was here, something alive, and it had been waiting for her, for all of them. Her eyes fell on the bookshelf in front of her, where an old leather-bound book caught her attention. It was unlike any of the others on the shelf, newer, more polished, with strange symbols etched onto its cover. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. The moment her hand touched the book, she felt a surge of energy. "The Book of Binding," she whispered to herself, reading the inscription on the spine. The pages were filled with detailed rituals that spoke of binding spirits, of crossing between worlds, of creating doors to the other side. It was all here, everything she needed to know. But the more she read, the more she realized that the book was dangerous. It had been written to help seal away the spirits that had been unleashed by the cult. But now, with the portal still open, the rituals described in the book would do the opposite. They would empower whatever dark entity had crossed over, making it stronger. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as she turned the pages, sealing the veil, binding the souls. The incantations were clear, but they came at a cost. There was no way to stop the ritual once it had begun, no way to undo what had been set in motion. And the final page was written in blood. The fourth, a choice. She closed the book, the weight of it almost too much to bear. She could feel the darkness pressing against her, pushing her to make a choice. She could seal the portal, banish the spirits back to the other side, but it would require a sacrifice. The spirits wouldn't go quietly. There would be loss, pain. Or she could let the house have what it wanted. The choice was hers. The whispers seemed to grow louder again, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Evelyn could feel the presence of the spirits surrounding her, closing in on her thoughts, begging for release. "You have to finish what you started." Evelyn swallowed hard, her mind racing. There was no turning back. The ritual had already begun. Episode 6. The Price of Silence 1. The weight of the decision. Evelyn stood in the darkened room, her fingers still trembling from the touch of the ancient book. The ritual she had discovered, the one that had been set into motion long ago by Isabel Carver and her cursed cult, had opened a door to the other side. But now, she knew the terrifying truth: the portal could not be closed without a cost. Her mind raced. The whispers had returned, louder, more urgent. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows lengthening as if they were alive, seeking to consume her. She could feel the pressing weight of the house's malevolent energy pushing against her. It was as though the manor itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. Evelyn glanced at the book again. It seemed to pulse, the ancient text alive with an unnatural energy. The final page, the one written in blood, was etched into her mind. The choice was clear: sacrifice to close the veil and bind the spirits back, or allow the darkness to grow, to let it consume everything in its path. She could feel the weight of those two paths pressing on her chest. "What happens if I choose neither?" she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. She knew the house would not allow her to ignore the choice. The silence was deafening, and the whispers were growing restless. They knew she was on the brink of a decision, and they were watching, waiting to see which path she would take. The second, the unseen hand. Evelyn stepped backward, her hand still gripping the book. The shadows seemed to stretch, creeping along the walls like living tendrils. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles that had once flickered with an eerie warmth. The house was cold, colder than it had ever been. The temperature dropped rapidly, her breath coming out in visible puffs. The whispers grew louder, more demanding. She turned toward the window, her eyes scanning the dark landscape outside. The trees that surrounded Black Hollow Manor stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching into the sky, twisting like fingers. The wind howled outside, but inside the manor, there was an oppressive silence. No birds, no movement, just the weight of the house and its secrets. Then, she heard the sound of footsteps. Evelyn spun around, her heart racing. There in the doorway stood a figure. A man, tall and thin, with pale skin and a cold, calculating expression. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. He was dressed in black, his clothes old-fashioned, as if he had stepped out of another time. "You've made a choice, Evelyn." The voice was smooth, yet there was an undeniable edge of danger to it. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The man stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing off the stone floor. "I know what you've discovered." He paused, his eyes glinting with something dark. "But you cannot simply walk away. Not anymore." Evelyn took a step back, clutching the book to her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want?" The man's lips curled into a dark smile. "My name is not important. What matters is that you and I are now bound by this place. The rituals have begun, Evelyn. And you are the key." Her heart raced in her chest as the realization hit her. "I'm not the only one who's been pulled into this," she whispered, almost to herself. "There are others." The man nodded, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Yes," he said, "but only one of us can leave this place alive. That is the price of silence, the price of the ritual. The third." The unraveling Evelyn's mind spun as the truth began to settle in. The darkness that had been unleashed in Black Hollow Manor was not just a force, it was alive, and it was bound to the house. But now, it sought something from her, something only she could provide. The man continued to speak, his words laced with a strange calm. "The veil between the worlds is thin, but once it's torn, it cannot be repaired without a sacrifice. You are the chosen one, Evelyn. You are the one who will make the ultimate decision." She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts that were threatening to overwhelm her. "Why me?" she demanded. "Why is this happening to me?" The man's eyes flickered with something dark. "You were always meant to come here, Evelyn. The house has been waiting for you. You have the power to choose. But once you choose, there will be no turning back." Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind spinning with the weight of what she had uncovered. The house, the spirits, the rituals, it was all connected. She could feel the darkness closing in on her, pushing her toward the altar, toward the final choice. But was it really a choice? Was she being guided, or was she being manipulated? The whispers were growing louder, the voices growing more urgent. There was no time left. The fourth, the ritual's final hour, the clock on the wall chimed, 12 midnight, the exact moment when the veil between the living and the dead would be at its thinnest. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the tension rise. The house had been waiting for this moment, and now the time had come. She could feel the power of the ritual swirling around her, tugging at her very soul. The man stepped closer, his face now just inches from hers. "You must decide," he whispered. "The portal is open. The spirits are waiting." Evelyn looked down at the book in her hands. The pages were open to the final ritual, the one that would seal the veil. She knew what she had to do. But could she go through with it? Could she sacrifice what was needed to stop the dark forces that had already begun to unravel the world? "What will you choose, Evelyn?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Evelyn stood frozen, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, the air thick with expectation. And then she made her choice. Episode 7, The Price of the Curse. The unraveling begins. Evelyn's hands shook as she stepped deeper into the heart of the manor. The ancient walls, once full of stories and whispers, now felt like the very bones of a dying beast. It was as if the house itself was breathing, its air thick and suffocating. The shadows stretched across the floor, reaching toward her, hungry and restless. Her fingers clenched around the book of binding. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final key to stopping the curse that had been set in motion. But Evelyn knew she wasn't just holding a book, she was holding the power to control the fate of the manor and its many tormented souls. The house seemed to hum around her, the air alive with an electric energy. She could feel the spirits watching her every move, their eyes heavy and expectant. And there, at the center of the room, was the altar, the place where it had all begun, the place where Isabel Carver and the cult had opened the veil. Evelyn could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The final ritual was upon her, and the weight of her decision felt heavier than ever. The whispers had been growing louder, more demanding, urging her to act. But was she ready to make the ultimate sacrifice? "The price of the curse is eternal," a voice whispered in her ear. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice wasn't just in her head, it was real. It was here, in the room with her. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. Only the flickering of candlelight and the oppressive silence of the manor. "You cannot escape what has already been set in motion," the voice continued, its tone low and menacing. "The curse has chosen you. It is your destiny to either seal the veil or let it consume everything." The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick with tension. Evelyn could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. There was no turning back now. She had to finish what had been started. The second. The choice. Evelyn approached the altar, her heart pounding louder in her ears with every step. The book felt heavier in her hands, as if it was trying to drag her down, to pull her into the abyss with it. The ancient symbols on the altar seemed to shimmer, glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. She could hear the whispers again, but this time they were different. They weren't pleading for release, they were demanding it. "Seal the veil," they whispered, "or face the consequences." The ritual was clear, she had to complete it. But as she gazed at the altar, her mind raced with doubts. What if she couldn't do it? What if the curse was too powerful to stop? "You must choose," the voice in the shadows said. "The house is waiting. The veil is open. The darkness is already here." Evelyn closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She knew she couldn't run, not anymore. The spirits would follow her, the curse would consume her, and Black Hollow Manor would remain trapped in the shadows forever. With trembling hands, she opened the book to the final page. The words were written in ancient ink, each letter sharp and precise. She could feel the power of the ritual radiating from the pages, urging her to act. But as she began to recite the incantation, something stopped her. A voice, her own voice, echoed in her mind. "What if I don't?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating her thoughts. What would happen if she didn't complete the ritual? Would she be trapped here forever? Would the curse be passed on to another innocent soul to suffer in her place? The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. "You must act." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she continued to speak the incantation. The words felt like they were being ripped from her soul, each syllable a painful burden. The air around her grew colder, the shadows in the room twisting and writhing as if they were alive. She reached the final words of the incantation, and for a moment, everything stopped. The room was silent, the air still. Then, with a sudden rush, the house seemed to breathe, the energy inside it pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The third, the unleashing, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and Evelyn gasped as she felt the room shift. The walls groaned, and the shadows grew even darker. It was as if the entire house was shuddering in response to the ritual she had completed. The very fabric of the manor seemed to tear, unraveling in slow motion, as if the veil between the living and the dead was being stretched beyond its limits. The voices of the spirits became a roar, a cacophony of anger and desperation. They filled her mind, drowning out everything else. She could see flashes of their faces twisted, contorted with rage, as they reached toward her with outstretched hands. They were angry, they were hungry, and then the air grew still again. The whispers faded, and Evelyn stood alone in the room. The shadows, the spirits, they were gone. But something else remained. The book in her hands felt lighter, almost empty, as if it had given up its power. Evelyn took a step back from the altar, her heart still racing. The house was silent now, but the silence was deafening. It felt wrong. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice shaky. But there was no answer. The manor was still. The ritual had been completed. But at what cost? She turned toward the door, her mind a blur of thoughts. What had she done? The spirits were silent, but their presence still lingered, like a shadow at the edge of her vision. And then she heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper. "It's not over, Evelyn." The voice was cold, distant, but unmistakable. It came from behind her, from the shadows. She turned around, her breath catching in her throat. To be continued. Episode 8. The Return of the Lost Eye. The awakening Evelyn woke with a start. The room around her was bathed in an eerie stillness, the silence so profound that it pressed against her ears like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Her breath was shallow, and she could feel the cold sweat clinging to her skin. Her heart thudded in her chest, the pounding echoing in the emptiness of the room. The night had been long, but the darkness that had claimed Black Hollow Manor felt endless. The rituals she had uncovered, the ancient forces she had disturbed, none of it had felt real until now. But the whispers, those whispers that had plagued her for weeks now, were louder, more insistent than ever. Evelyn's eyes darted to the window, her pulse racing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the desolate grounds. But it wasn't just the moonlight that chilled her, it was the sense of something waiting. Something that had been awakened by the actions she had taken. She stumbled out of bed, her body still heavy from the exhaustion of what she had already gone through. But there was no time to rest. The whispers were not just in her mind anymore. They had taken on a life of their own, crawling up her spine, urging her toward the inevitable. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the journal. The cursed book of binding, its dark, leather-bound pages stained with old ink and ancient blood. She had to finish this. She had to stop whatever had been set in motion. The whispers, now clearer, were no longer just urging her. They were commanding her. The second, the unseen forces. The manor itself seemed to pulse, its dark energy flooding the room. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, as if the house were trying to communicate, its groans the only sound in the otherwise deafening silence. Evelyn's heart raced faster, as she knew that whatever had been done in this place, the curse was far from over. She could feel the power of the veil pulling at her. It was as if the boundary between the living and the dead had been ripped open, and the spirits of the lost were no longer confined to their own world. They were here with her, and they were not content to simply wait. Evelyn's mind flashed back to that moment when she had first uncovered the truth in the book of binding. The cult's ritual, the one that had torn the veil, had been unspeakably dark. But it wasn't just the spirits they had unleashed. They had summoned something more powerful, something far older than any of them. "You cannot escape what you have done," the voice whispered through her mind, cold and filled with an unearthly malice. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the corner of the room. There, in the dim shadows, stood the figure of a man, or at least, it resembled one. His face was hidden in the dark, but she could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, as if he were watching her soul. "It's time." The voice came again, sharper now, more defined. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped forward, its presence dark and suffocating. She could feel his energy filling the room, as though the air itself were thickening with the weight of something ancient. The figure did not speak again, but Evelyn could feel his intentions, his desires. He was not here to help her. He was here to claim her, to pull her further into the abyss. The third. The curse deepens. Evelyn stepped back, her mind racing. She was running out of time. She could feel the darkness closing in on her, pushing her further into the web of the ritual, the curse that had already begun to consume the manor. "You have no choice." The figure's voice reverberated in her mind, deeper now, as though it were coming from all directions. "The ritual has been started. You will see it through. You will finish what was begun, or you will be consumed along with this house." Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. The very air felt alive, a presence that weighed down on her shoulders and pressed against her chest. She wanted to run, to escape, but she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not when the veil had been torn and whatever had once been contained was now free. The shadows around her grew longer, stretching out like fingers reaching for her. She could hear the faint, distant wail of someone screaming in the darkness. But no one was there. No one living, anyway. The spirits had awoken, and they were restless, angry. Her mind flashed to the book of binding again. The final page. The part of the ritual that was still unfinished. It was the only way to put an end to this, but the cost was unimaginable. The price of sealing the veil, of banishing the spirits, was sacrifice. A sacrifice of blood, of soul. To complete the ritual, she had to give something up, something far greater than she was willing to lose. But what choice did she have? The house was already alive, its pulse beating in time with hers. She was trapped. The spirits were waiting. The fourth, the final choice. The figure advanced, his presence growing more oppressive with every step. "You have already made your choice," he said softly, almost like a whisper of silk. "The ritual is in your hands now." Evelyn's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel the stone in her pocket, the one that had been with her since the first moment the house had begun to change. It pulsed softly, like the beating of a heart. The dark force that had been awakened was linked to the stone, and the stone to her. She could feel its power flowing into her, feeding on her fear, on her desperation. The figure stopped in front of her, his face still hidden in shadow. "You are the one who will complete the cycle." His voice, so cold and calculating, echoed in the room. "You will be the vessel for the final ritual. You will open the portal for us." "No!" Evelyn gasped, shaking her head, her hands trembling as she backed away. "I won't do it. I won't let you." The figure reached out, his hand moving toward her, fingers curled like claws. "You have no choice. You are already bound to this place. The spirits are waiting, and so is the curse." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the figure's fingers brushed her arm. The cold was unbearable, like ice seeping into her very bones. And then, suddenly, the room shifted again. The shadows seemed to grow darker, deeper, and the very walls of Black Hollow Manor seemed to bend around her. The whispering voices returned, louder than before, as the walls seemed to pulse and stretch. The air became heavy with power, with the weight of something ancient and terrifying. Episode 9, Through the Shattered Veil 1. The silence before the storm. Evelyn's body trembled as the last words of the incantation echoed in her mind. The air around her grew heavier, as if the very atmosphere had thickened, suffocating her. The shadows in Black Hollow Manor seemed to shift, their forms twisting, stretching, and creeping along the walls, like living things. The room, once familiar, now felt like it was closing in on her, a prison made of darkness and forgotten souls. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. "It's too late," a voice whispered. But this time, it wasn't the shadowy figure from earlier. This voice was her own, the voice of someone she had tried to bury deep inside her. The voice that had always been there, hiding in the corners of her mind, urging her toward the darkness. The floor beneath her feet vibrated, and the temperature plummeted. Cold seeped into her skin, turning her veins to ice. The mirror on the far wall began to glow, the surface shimmering like water, rippling with an unnatural energy. Evelyn's heart raced as she took a step toward it. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. At first, it seemed like a simple distortion, the kind that happens when glass cracks under pressure. But as she stared at it, the figure in the reflection began to change. It wasn't her. It was someone else. A woman, a shadowy figure, cloaked in dark robes, with a face that Evelyn couldn't quite make out. And then it spoke. "You should have never come here." The words chilled Evelyn to her very core. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure in the mirror didn't answer. It only smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. The smile seemed to stretch, becoming more grotesque with each passing second, until it split the face in half. The woman's mouth opened wider, revealing a mouth full of blackened teeth, sharp and jagged like broken glass. Evelyn recoiled, taking a step back, her breath quickening. The woman in the mirror's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Evelyn felt as if she were being pulled into the glass, sucked into a world of darkness. "You cannot escape," the woman said, her voice now filled with malice. "You are part of the curse, and it will never let you go." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had thought the ritual was complete. She had thought she could seal the veil between worlds. But the mirror, the woman in it, something had gone terribly wrong. The whispers were growing louder, rising into a cacophony that seemed to invade her very thoughts. The walls of the manor seemed to bend and warp, twisting with the sounds of tormented souls. The spirits, those trapped in the manor, were calling to her, but not for salvation. They were angry, hungry. Evelyn's hands shook as she reached for the book of binding, lying on the altar. She needed to finish what she had started. She had to close the door, seal the spirits away. But as her fingers brushed the cover of the book, she felt something stir within her. A dark presence. The same presence she had felt when she first set foot in Black Hollow Manor. The second, the return of the lost souls. The darkness in the room seemed to swallow her whole. and Evelyn felt her mind begin to unravel. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the air around her seemed to pulse with a strange foreign energy. The house was alive. It was no longer a structure, but something alive, feeding off her fear, her confusion. The mirror began to crack, the sound like glass shattering in the dead of night. The crack spread across the surface, splintering the reflection into 1,000 pieces. The woman in the mirror, the shadow, was gone, but her presence remained, lingering in the fragments of the broken glass. Evelyn's heart raced. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in the manor any longer. The ritual had gone wrong. The spirits had been unleashed, and the darkness had taken root. But as she turned toward the door, she froze. "It's not over," a voice whispered. The voice was familiar, her own voice. Only now it was twisted, distorted by the weight of the curse. The shadows in the room seemed to respond to the voice, shifting and writhing like snakes, reaching for her. Evelyn tried to move, but her body refused to obey. Her legs felt like lead, heavy and immobile. The presence in the room was overwhelming, its power so strong that it seemed to crush her from all sides. The floor beneath her feet began to crack, the stones splitting as if it were being torn apart by an invisible force. And then the darkness surged forward. The spirits emerged from the walls, their twisted faces haunting Evelyn's every thought. They were the lost souls, the ones who had died in Black Hollow Manor, trapped in the house for eternity. But now they were free to torment, free to feed. Evelyn screamed as the spirits surrounded her, their voices a cacophony of anguish and rage. Their cold fingers brushed against her skin, sending waves of ice through her body. They were pulling her in, dragging her toward the altar, toward the broken veil. "You will become one of us," the voices whispered. "You will be lost, just like the others." The room seemed to shift again, the walls closing in. Evelyn's vision blurred as she struggled to breathe. The air was thick with power, and the spirits were feeding off her fear. She could feel herself slipping, losing control, losing herself to the darkness. But just as she thought she would be consumed, a voice broke through the madness. "You can still stop this," the voice said. Evelyn turned, her heart racing. The figure she had seen in the mirror was standing before her, alive, no longer a shadow. She was no longer the faceless woman she had seen before. Her features were now clear, her eyes wide, and filled with an almost sadistic glee. "You can still save them," the figure whispered, a cruel smile curling at the corners of her mouth. "But you must give up everything." The final choice. Evelyn's mind spun as she stared at the woman, the figure who had once been a shadow. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "I can't." "You can," the woman interrupted, "but the price is high. You must become one with the house. You must become the guardian of the veil. Only then will you be able to stop the curse." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the house pulling her in, the spirits swirling around her, their energy feeding off her emotions. The power was too much. It was pulling her into the heart of the manor, into the very soul of Black Hollow. But could she really do it? Could she sacrifice herself to stop the curse? To save the lost souls trapped in this place? "There is no other way," the woman said. "You know what must be done." Evelyn closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. "If I do this, will it end?" The woman smiled, her eyes glowing with a dark satisfaction. "It will end, but your soul will never be the same." Evelyn took a deep breath and stepped forward, her resolve hardening. She had no choice. She had to save herself, and the others who had been trapped here. The ritual had gone wrong, but she could still make it right. She had to. Episode 10, Through the Veil of Shadows 1. The darkness unleashed. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the ground beneath her feet trembled. She could feel the house shifting, groaning, as though it were alive, awakening from a long, tormented slumber. The veil between the living and the dead had been torn wide open, and the spirits that had once been trapped in the walls of Black Hollow Manor were now free to roam. But the cost was more than Evelyn had bargained for. The darkness had taken hold, and it wasn't just the manor that was at risk. The world itself was beginning to crack. The air around her grew thick with the presence of something else. Not a spirit, not a ghost, but a force far older and more powerful than anything Evelyn had ever imagined. The shadows in the room were alive, moving as if they had minds of their own, seeking to claim her. "You have opened the door," a voice whispered from the darkness, "and now you will see what lies beyond." Evelyn turned, her breath caught in her throat. The room was empty, but the air was charged with an energy so powerful, it felt as though the walls themselves were watching her. The whispers had shifted, no longer just random voices, but now a collective murmur, speaking in one unified voice. She stumbled backward, her mind racing as the weight of what she had done settled in. The ritual was supposed to close the portal, not open it. She had broken the veil, and in doing so, she had unleashed the worst of the darkness that had been trapped for centuries. "It's too late now," the voice echoed again, its tone cold, unforgiving. "You cannot undo what has been done." Evelyn's fingers gripped the book of binding tighter, the ancient text warm against her palm. It had brought her this far, but was it enough to close the door once and for all? Or had she unknowingly set the stage for something far worse? The second, the shifting shadows. The shadows in the room began to lengthen, their dark tendrils reaching for Evelyn as though they were alive, eager to claim her soul. The once quiet manor now felt like a living beast, its hunger palpable, as though the house itself was starved for more. Evelyn's breath came faster as she backed into the corner of the room, the ancient book in her hands glowing with a strange light. She needed answers. She needed to know what was happening to her, to the world outside these walls. What had she set free? What had she become? Her mind raced, thinking back to the ancient text she had uncovered. Isabel Carver, the cult leader, had been the one to first invoke the ritual, and it was she who had first torn the veil. But Evelyn had never anticipated that the ritual would bind her to it, that she would become a vessel for the dark forces that were now pouring through. The house trembled again, more violently this time. Evelyn could feel the energy shift, becoming more intense, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to rip apart at the seams. The shadows grew darker, more oppressive, as if they were closing in on her from every direction. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was not a spirit, not a ghost. It was a man, but not like any man Evelyn had ever seen. He was tall, with pale, sharp features that seemed to glow in the dark. His eyes were black as coal, endless, empty voids that seemed to stare into her very soul. And when he spoke, his voice was like the grating of stone against stone, cold and unfeeling. "You've unleashed me," he said, his words low and full of dark amusement. "And now I am free." Evelyn gasped as she realized what he was. He was the darkness itself, the force that had been trapped behind the veil for centuries. And now he was here, standing before her, his power unbound. "You've broken the rules, child," he continued, his voice echoing through the room. "The veil was never meant to be torn, and now the world will pay the price for your curiosity." Evelyn's mind whirled. She had heard of dark entities that were bound by the veil, but this was something far worse. This wasn't a mere spirit, it was a primal force of darkness, a being born from the very essence of night itself. "I didn't mean to," Evelyn began, but the figure cut her off. "You never do you?" His smile was cruel, twisting his features. "But your intentions don't matter anymore. The damage is done." The air grew heavier, and Evelyn could feel the house around her tightening like a noose. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the shadows were closing in, suffocating her. She reached for the book, but the figure laughed, a sound like gravel scraping against the earth. "Do you think the book will save you now?" he mocked. "You can't undo what has been done. You can't close the door you've opened." The darkness in the room intensified, swirling around her like a storm, threatening to consume everything in its path. Evelyn could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She was being pulled into the void, dragged towards something terrible, something that she could never have imagined. But just as she thought the darkness would swallow her whole, something shifted. The air around her cracked, like the sound of a distant thunderstorm, and then there was light. A flash of bright light filled the room, breaking through the shadows and pushing the darkness back, if only for a moment. Evelyn blinked, disoriented. The light began to coalesce, forming a figure. A woman, dressed in white, her face serene, yet there was something haunting about her presence. "You are not alone, Evelyn," Evelyn said, her voice calm, yet filled with an eerie sense of knowing. "You have the power to stop this." The third, the final choice. The figure before her was familiar, yet unfamiliar. Evelyn recognized her, but she couldn't place where or when she had seen her before. The woman was radiant, glowing with an ethereal light that seemed to counter the darkness that surrounded them. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice hoarse. The woman smiled, her gaze filled with a deep sadness. "I am the one who has been watching you." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "Why now? Why haven't you stopped this before?" The woman's expression softened, and she stepped closer, the light growing brighter with each movement. "Because you had to make the choice. You had to choose to act." Evelyn's mind swirled with confusion. "What choice?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She only nodded toward the book of binding in Evelyn's hands, the one she had used to start the ritual. "The power to stop the curse is in your hands, Evelyn, but it comes with a price." Evelyn clenched her fists, the book beginning to burn with an intense heat. She could feel the energy shifting again. The house was still trembling, but this time the darkness felt contained, like it was waiting for something. "You must choose, Evelyn," the woman said softly. "Close the veil for good, or leave the door open and let the world succumb to the darkness." Evelyn's heart raced. She was standing on the edge of an abyss, and the choice she made now would determine everything: her fate, the fate of the manor, and the fate of the spirits trapped within. But was she strong enough to make that choice?